Armarurumque cano Troia qui primus ab oris. The Aeneid, a famous poem full of thousands of verses, a great example of Latin. Armarurumque cano. Now, you could see this convention, or you could see this. You see a totally different spelling convention here, in quite a few areas, in fact. But it's still Armarurumque cano Troia qui primus ab oris. So what are we looking at? We're looking at Latin. We're looking at Lingua Latina, the Latin language. This series shall get into Latin. We'll get into the phonetics, the phonology. We'll get into the pronunciation, the syllable weight, the quantitativeness of Latin. And we'll really look at it in depth and get a good understanding of how it works, more so than other people might get you into. This is going to be a very deep series. Now, Latin is very different from English. The pronunciation, the phonetics, the prosody, the versification, the musicality. We're going to look at all those things and really understand Latin in this series. We'll get really into it, and we'll truly understand it. I hesitate to call it classical pronunciation because other people use that term differently than I do. I tend to look at Latin and I think about how it was actually spoken. And we are not going to actually follow the classical convention in this series. And so, here we have the source of our capital letters. This is called monumental font. This is what was on the outside of monuments in ancient Rome, and it's the source of our capital letters. But we also have this, Roman cursive. Now this is what the Romans used to write on paper with. This is the cursive. We use the term cursive, but it's not a fancy sort of script. This was what they wrote everything with, and it's the source of our lowercase letters. But the problem is, we have a culture today in which we take spelling for granted, we take our own language for granted, we take phonetics for granted. We're not properly taught phonetics, and we're not properly taught spelling, or how it works, or where it came from. So we're left a little bit confused, and we need to start taking out the clouds that confuse us, and we need to start understanding how language works and how our own language works and where our own language came from. So take this, for example, the sentence that we now pronounce, child in the night. Well, in the 15th century, this was pronounced child in the nicht. And, a person in that time would have seen these words in the mind, and, the same spelling was being used, but they said child in the nicht, where we say child in the night. And the problem is, what we're looking at is a vowel shift. In the 15th, 16th century, when it started, when it ended is debatable, but around that time you had this vowel shifting happening. And other languages changed pronunciation too. Greek went through a vowel shift, but other languages, other cultures appropriately changed their spelling when pronunciation changes happened. We didn't, or we tried. It's kind of complicated. But when you learn something like Latin or another language that appropriately changes spelling for pronunciation. So let's take a look at Latin now, shall we? We're not going to get into semivowels quite yet. These are the semivowels. The semivowels will be a few lessons ahead. Today we're going to look at some consonants. Here we have some. Ka and ga. Ka, ga. Ka, ga. These are two consonants, one's voiced, one's unvoiced. A voiced consonant uses your vocal cords. Ga, you're voicing it. Now, of course, we're looking at a non-plosive use. Now, I'll get into non-plosiveness in a different video. But let's move on. Clamo, clamare. There's our verb right there. Now let's conjugate. Clamo, clamas, clama. That's a pretty easy one. So let's look at the vowels here. O. That's duration. We're not looking at lax and tense, which English looks at. Latin is mainly about duration, and we'll get into duration a lot more in other videos, but it's important to remember how this is pronounced. These vowels here. O. There's duration there, not lax intensive like English. Duration. Claw. Claw. That's duration right there. Now, these are macrons I'm using right now. I didn't use macrons in some of my earlier videos, but they will help you when I do decide to use them. And, of course, I can trick you and not use them and make you think I'm going to. I might be a little bit tricky, but that's part of learning. So, here is our alphabet right here. You can see the entire thing. And these are each of our letters, and we'll get into each of them. We'll talk about all kinds of interaction, all kinds of elision. And it can be a little bit messy, complicated, there's a lot to get into. But once you really understand this, the musicality, the duration, the unplosiveness, you'll get to understand Latin a lot better, and you'll get to understand your own language a lot better. You'll be able to understand how languages work properly and to be ready for other languages when you get into them. Learning languages is an amazing thing, and when you can properly understand the pronunciation, then you can really appreciate the language when you speak it, when you recite it, and you can really feel like you're there, like you're a part of it, like you can possibly understand maybe what it's like to be a Roman.